thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to stand up here and get all nervous in front of you, but we hope that you're going to enjoy our little conversation here about things that matter, like Homeland Security and cybersecurity. I'd like to introduce former Secretary, Homeland Secretary Michael Chertoff. Big applause.
Thanks.
So before we begin, by way of proper introductions, the EastWest Institute is a global conflict prevention group. And what makes it different than Heritage Foundation or Brookings Institution or some other think and do tanks is that we are primarily a do tank. And what that means is that we seek to bring people together who wouldn't otherwise talk or have a conversation and might be in conflict or might eventually be in conflict, and then try to have a conversation which actually builds trust. And what we try to do by way of that conversation is work into conflict prevention, conflict resolution. We have a number of tales that we could tell. The one I would share with you that we use most often is conversations that were made in very private places in East Germany, i.e. Potsdam, between the East and the West Germans and Mr. Gorbachev, who ran and ruled over Russia, the Soviet Union, before its collapse. 8 months, something like that, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what we were trying to do in those conversations were bring these different groups together to talk about how they saw their immediate future. And the immediate future was what? The Berlin Wall came down. And as a result of that, we had all the parties talking together and trying to find an answer, a resolution to a problem, to a future together. So that's what the EastWest Institute is about. And I've had the great pleasure of being affiliated with the EastWest Institute for a number of years. I sat on the board. Michael Chertoff sits on the board now. The reason he sits on the board is because there is nobody better in the United States to come talk to us about cybersecurity. And we have a cybersecurity program. So I would urge you to have a look at the EastWest Institute website and take a peek at the cybersecurity program. Cybersecurity and Homeland Security are what? They are very complex. They are much talked about. They are relatively new challenges for all of us. And if we look at all the political pundits, whether on television or looking to be president of the United States, they're all over it. Secretary Chertoff's background, he's a Harvard grad, undergrad and law grad. He spent years working in New York as a prosecutor. And he was prosecuting who? The mafia, terrorists, fraudsters, and the like. From there, he was asked to be Homeland Secretary by former President Bush, which he did for 4 years, and now has built up a group called the Chertoff Group, which provides risk management analysis and services to the private sector. So having said that, would you like to maybe qualify what I forgot?
No, glad to be here. I've never been to Jackson Hole, and I see the smoke from the fires out west blew off, and weather's been great. So I'm delighted to be here and have a conversation about some important and interesting things.
Great. So here's my favorite story of the day. Who knows Ashley Madison? Raise your hand. So for those of you who don't know Ashley Madison, the website was hacked. And it has 37 million subscriber users. And I think the logo goes something like this. Live a great life / have an affair. 37 million people got breached. Pretty scary. And we learned today about 5 suicides as a result of that breach. So does cybersecurity matter? In 2014, one of the big banks in the country spent $250 million. They had 1,000 people working around the world on cybersecurity prevention. They had 76 million accounts breached. Last figure, in 2014, the world's economies paid up $400 billion to deal with cybersecurity. In other words, they lost that money. Let me be more precise. The cyber attacks cost the world GDP $400 billion. So that's a huge problem. And the Homeland Security problem, beginning with 9/11, when the Homeland Security Department was formed, correct?
A couple years afterwards.
Okay. All of a sudden, our government decided that we had to look at where we stood relative to intelligence and protecting the nation and doing something about it. So this is where we're going to go in the conversation. So having said that, my first question is about national security. And I think what we'll start out by saying is simply, what do you think are the biggest threats, the greatest threats to the nation today?
So I guess I'd put them into three categories. One is the category of ideological threats or movements that are extreme. And I think what we're seeing now in the Middle East and actually in Europe, and we saw it a couple of days ago with this individual on a train who tried to kill people with an AK-47 and happily was overpowered by a bunch of Americans, there's a movement out there that is dedicated to killing Americans and Westerners in the service of what they believe will be the recreation of a caliphate ruled according to a kind of a radical Islamist doctrine, covering the space between West Africa and all the way to maybe the Indian subcontinent. So that's one set of threats. The next set of threats is really a throwback to the 20th century. It's Russia. Remember when Mitt Romney was asked the question during the last presidential campaign, what's the biggest threat? And he said Russia. And then the press laughed at him and said, oh, this guy's living in the past. Well, this year, the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, was asked by Congress in his hearing, what's the biggest threat to America these days? And he said Russia. So I guess someone owes Romney an apology. It's not a joke. The Russians are pushing on NATO. They've not only seized Crimea, and that's the first time since the Second World War period, that there's actually been a change of borders with military force. Actually, Georgia, there was a change of borders when the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. So the Russians have basically been breaking the cardinal system that we've had in Europe since the Second World War, which was no more conquest by warfare. And now they're destabilizing Ukraine. They're probing and provoking in the Baltics, and even in Western Europe with overflights and things of that sort. So that's the second issue. And then the third issue, I would say, is what we're seeing now with cyber. And there cyber is not an enemy. Cyber is a means that enemies can attack us. So I would say those are the three biggest challenges, but I wouldn't want to leave the discussion without also mentioning Iran. I think we're apparently on the verge of an agreement, and I think the consequences of that are going to be felt over the next 10 years and more, and there's a lot to be said about that as well.
So if you pursue that and we look out to the future, how much do we know actually about the threats that we face, and more importantly, are we actually prepared to deal with these threats, do you think?
I think we know a pretty fair amount about a lot of the threats we face. Whether we're prepared to deal with them is a different issue. It's a question not only of capability, but of willpower. Are we willing to take the steps necessary to protect ourselves? One of the lessons of the Second World War, the lead up to the Second World War, which I think we have relearned in the last several years, is that it is easy for very smart people to rationalize not doing something and letting events take their course. When I studied history in school, and Neville Chamberlain, he came back with the pact, the Munich Pact with Hitler. He said, "Peace in our time." And from the looking backwards over 30 or 40 years, you say to yourself, "Oh, how could this guy be so stupid to think this was going to stop Hitler. But I must say I've seen things in the last several years where we've conceded things or ceded things or told ourselves that it's not really clear, it's kind of murky, and therefore we shouldn't do anything. And I understand what it is smart people being able to talk themselves out of taking difficult steps. So I think that to me, the willpower issue is the huge issue we face going forward.
Okay, so that makes me think about risk management. And risk management means that we have to figure out what we should prioritize in order to actually deal with the risk. So how would you address that?
So first and foremost, what we have to prioritize from a national security standpoint is we've got to protect our own citizens. That's obviously true with citizens at home. It's also true with citizens that are traveling or working overseas. We also, close behind that, is our obligation to protect our friends, countries that are our allies, that we share common bond with, common values with. And then there's some more general issues, like we want to preserve the freedom of the seas. We want to preserve freedom of the internet. We want to have an open trade regime. We want to be able to travel, without fear. So I would say those are all part of the national security set of risks that are our main focal point.
We all hear about ISIS, Islamic radicalism, however you want to term it, and it presents a big challenge. I think it's an example of what you're referring to. So the question I would have for you is, how do you see that problem, number one, generally, and number two, when you look out to the future, what do you think that we should be doing about it that we maybe haven't done?
So I would say with respect to all the things I've talked about, in a way what we're doing is we're competing with alternative systems of society and government. In the case of ISIS, you have an ideology, and the ideology is that the way to run a country and to run a society is to have a few leaders talk to God, and then they're going to tell you what to do. It's kind of a theocracy, and an extreme theocracy that finds its roots by cherry-picking through parts of the Quran and picking out particular parts they want in order to create what I would say is a throwback society. And they are competing with us by presenting people who are disaffected, who may have issues with their own identity, who may have grievances. They present them with an alternative model. They say, you don't have to be living in Western societies where you're excluded or you feel like somehow you're not treated with respect. Come here to Iraq and Syria. God is with us. God has blessed us. You'll have slaves. We'll give you a house. It'll be like paradise. And all you have to do is fight for the violent jihadi cause. And if you get killed, you'll go to heaven and get 100 virgins or 700 or whatever it is. And that's appealing to some people. It's a narrative of what would be on offer to them that is much more attractive to them than what they have in their own lives. And by the way, not very different from what violent drug gangs use to recruit people. They basically recruit people in disaffected areas by saying you'll have money, you'll have flashy cars, you'll have lots of girls, and that appeals pretty much to the same mentality. But to close the loop with a couple of other things, the Chinese also compete with an alternative narrative. And their narrative is, we will give you economic freedom, and you've described this as Confucian, but you're not going to control your government. The brightest technocrats will control the government. And if we perform, that legitimates us. If we fail, then you'll get rid of us and another group will come in. So that's kind of a hybrid, semi-capitalist, semi-autocratic system. Then you have the Russian approach, Putin's approach, which is basically, let's try to replicate an organized crime syndicate on a national scale. And we'll use violence, intimidation. It's got elements of right-wing populism embedded in it. They create an enemy, in this case the United States, and the enemy is responsible for all the bad things that happen. So I put that out there to say, when you look at these issues, what they have in common is they're about competing visions of society and the way people ought to live. So to get to ISIS, the ideology, you have to confront it in two ways. One is you have to recognize that one of their main recruiting tools is the fact that they seem to be doing pretty well. I mean, the way they would put it is they are now occupying territory larger than any other terrorist group did, and maybe as large as New York State. Whether this is true or not, they will present themselves as creating, benefits for the people who are part of their movement. And for the people who are not part of their movement, they're going to become slaves or concubines. And in much the same way as drug gangs recruit with visions of how life is going to be when you're a gang member, this is attracting a lot of people, particularly in Western Europe, but also here as well. And the other thing they've done, which is a bit of a twist on al-Qaeda, is they've moved from command and control terrorism or network terrorism to crowdsourced terrorism, which is come fight with us, but if you can't, go to your kitchen, see if you can make a bomb or get a gun or a knife or an axe and do however much killing against, the enemy in his own home or her own home that you can possibly get away with. So how do you deal with this? It strikes me there's two parts to this. One is you have to show they're not winning. If you're fighting them and they're still in the ring, you're losing. You have to take them out of the ring. And that may mean you have to do a little more than we're doing now. But the worst thing in the world is to have a situation where it appears to be in a stalemate, because in that case, given the U.S. being a global power, a lot of people looking on are going to say, wow, the insurgents are winning. And so I think that's at one level. At a second level, we do have to recognize that as phony and as flawed as it is, the vision of Islam they're peddling, if it's not answered, is going to appeal to some people. So you've got to get people from the Islamic community, religious leaders, people who are leaders in society, have got to go, and we've got to give them a platform and a means to fight back against that. And they've got to explain that what these extremists are peddling is not accurate. So there was a piece in the paper the other day about how Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader, and some of the other top guys in ISIS were saying that slavery is acceptable in Islam, and that's why we have slaves, and we're going to get more slaves, and that's going to make it even better to be part of this. And a number of imams actually put out a statement. They said, no, that's wrong. Although at the time of the Quran, there was slavery in many societies, the Quran does not bless or encourage slavery. And in fact, Muhammad married a slave, and another slave was invited to give the call to prayer. So they're pushing back against that. And I think that's got to be a second part of the strategy.
So the common link in there, well, one of the common links in all of that is the internet. And the internet makes me think of the cybersecurity conversation. And I guess the next question would logically be, we've got the public sector over here, we have the private sector over here. Both are being challenged, both are being hacked. For example, the private sector, if you take the banks, before I came back here in 2005 and started my wealth management business, I worked internationally for 25 years. I was in a bank that was dedicated to wealth management. And we had layers of IT systems, from the 80s until now, actually from the 70s until now, that got pieced together. And when you do that, and this is true of most financial institutions, when you do that patchwork, the cybersecurity piece, there's always like a little gate or a door or a crack that somebody can actually get into. So that's a private sector challenge. Forget about Ashley Madison for a second, because that is another whole conversation. But then if you look at the public sector and the things that you must have had to deal with, from OPM now to what it was before and their systems, how do you deal with that challenge? Like, where do you start and where do you try to go relative to cybersecurity, to put it into context?
So cybersecurity, you got to look at it as a system. And so let's begin by talking about what my business partner, Mike Hayden, sometimes says, sins and sinners. What are the things you worry about, and then who are the people who are carrying them out? Basically, there are four types of things we worry about as possible attacks. One is fraud, theft, draining bank accounts, extortion, where people plant ransomware on your computer and they say, if you don't give us, like $1,000, you'll never be able to get at your data because it's encrypted and we'll never give you the key to open it. Second layer of things you worry about are espionage, theft of intellectual property, often done on a nation-state scale. And the U.S. government has pointed out that China has had a robust program of really using their capabilities to steal commercial secrets, not just to engage in national security intelligence collection. The third is activism. I mean, I guess this group that hacked into that site was an activist group. You've got other groups like Anonymous or LulzSec that have sometimes attacked. And what they try to do is either disrupt or deface a site or get embarrassing information, put it out there. When there was the attack on Sony last year, part of what the North Koreans did was they got emails and proprietary information. They put it out there in order to embarrass the company. And then the biggest concern is an attack that actually destroys a system. In 2012, there was an attack on Saudi Aramco and 30,000 machines, devices were destroyed with all the data on them. Sony was also the subject of a destructive attack that affected its communication and IT infrastructure. So those are the four different kinds of things you worry about in terms of attacks. Now, who are the attackers? You have criminals, who they're mostly interested in the first part. You have ideologues, who are interested in the activism piece. Then you have nation states who are interested in the espionage, although you get some private actors as well there too. And finally, with respect to an attack that would be destructive, you would either have nation states engaged in what could amount to warfare, or you could have terrorists who want to destroy critical infrastructure, or, for example, as was demonstrated about a month ago, would want to hack into an automobile and affect the performance of the automobile and maybe have it stop or have it shut down or even drive off the road. So we've got this list of things that can happen and these list of bad things that can happen. The question is, how do you deal with it? And I think the answer is, first, you have to be realistic. You are not stopping all intrusions into your network. That is not possible, any more than it's possible for any human being to say, I'm never going to get sick. You're going to have intrusions. The question is, how do you recognize it, mitigate it, deal with it, and make sure that it doesn't get to your most significant assets? Second point is you have to recognize it's not a technical problem, it's a human problem. The machines are not on their own deciding they want to attack you. I mean, maybe in 10 years when we have the Terminator, and autonomous robots, maybe they will decide that, but we're not there yet. So you got to think about what are human beings trying to do, and what is their strategy, and how do you counter their strategy? And finally, you have to recognize that many of the worst intrusions aren't the result of very sophisticated, zero-day exploits or malware that gets by all the defenses, but they are the product of failures of human behavior, maliciousness, people getting fooled into clicking on links that they shouldn't do, bad cyber hygiene, things which can be corrected with education and training and exercising. So you've got to look at it as there's not a single answer, but as a series of things you have to put in place as part of a comprehensive strategy.
So I read in the paper today, I don't know if you saw this, by the way, but that the United States Securities and Exchange Commission was not going to prosecute Target for their hack. I don't know how many of you know this, but a year or two, maybe 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Target was hacked in a big way. But it doesn't mean that they don't have private litigation, et cetera. Right. So the question would be, what is the role of government? What are the boundaries? To what extent should government actually be involved in all of this? And frankly, what is the role of private enterprise?
Yeah. Well, most of the network and most of the data is in private hands. So unless you want the government to own all your networks and operate all of your communications equipment, which I don't think anybody wants, private sector is going to have to take most of the responsibility. What government is going to have to do is three things. First, create a better regime of information sharing, which means not only giving government information to the private sector and having the private sector share with government what they're seeing, but also sharing it among actors in the private sector. And you've got to create a legal structure that encourages that, so that if someone gets attacked, usually if there's a follow-on with other attacks with the same tool, you want to get the word out quickly and you can shut it down. Second thing, which I think would be helpful, is to actually have the government create some liability incentives to promote cybersecurity. Things that would give you, if you do reasonable things to protect yourself, some kind of liability cap that would encourage the investment in cybersecurity. Right now, a lot of companies, they want to invest, but they don't know how much, and they're not sure whether there's a return on investment, so they feel kind of helpless. The third area the government can do something in, and this is the most complicated, is actually when does the government actually intervene to block something or actually to go back and destroy the server or the network that is launching the attack. Certainly on the government's own system, the government does have a process of blocking attacks. One of the questions which has to be debated is, with our critical infrastructure, should companies that really operate national critical infrastructure have an arrangement with the government that when an attack is coming in, if it can be seen, it can be blocked. But you need to bear in mind, it's not like the old days when all attacks came in from outside and you could see them like seeing missiles coming in. A lot of times attacks come from inside. Either people wittingly or unwittingly invite in malware, or they'll put a thumb drive in, or maybe someone who's disgruntled will put a malicious tool into a network. So I wouldn't over-rely on the idea of the government blocking, although the government can sometimes help people remediate and fix the problem. And then the question is, when is it appropriate for the government to say, attacks are coming from that server, we're going to take that server out, we're going to destroy it, either using cyber tools or even physical tools. And I think most people would agree that if you had a physically destructive attack against the U.S. that resulted in loss of American life or substantial economic or property damage, that would rise to the level of an act of war, and that would warrant defensive action. But exactly where that line is, or what do you do when there's ambiguity about who launched the attack, I think that those are questions that are still being debated.
And the private sector?
I think the private sector's got, again, you've got to recognize that protecting your assets from your data from cyber or physical attacks or theft is as important as protecting your bank account. And that means you've got to have an understanding of what your key assets are and be able to build an architecture and a strategy that allows you not only to protect the perimeter, which doesn't really exist, but to actually be aware always of what's going on inside your network and to regulate, all kinds of fundamental questions, like who gets to have privileges to, change things in the network or to alter settings, who gets access, who gets to download. These are all issues that address vulnerabilities that reduce or elevate risk, and there are trade-offs between that and efficiency.
Okay, so that makes me think of something else, still relative to the government, which would be information sharing with the private sector. How does that need to work in the future as compared to how it's working now?
I mean, ideally what you would do is you would create platforms, and they have some of these, where in real time, when there is a indication of an attack or a new piece of malware, a new exploit, it would be rapidly shared and disseminated to other major parts of critical infrastructure and within the government as well. And ideally, you want to do it in real time. You literally want to have an operations centers being able to speak to each other about what they're seeing when they characterize malware or things of that sort.
And from a legislative point of view?
I mean, you'd have to, create legislation that tells people that sharing this information is not going to be subjected to some liability or not going to be treated as an invasion of privacy or something of that sort.
Okay, so does that bring up the backdoor encryption conversation?
Okay, so there's
or am I ahead of the curve?
No, I mean, so a separate issue is this. Putting aside the question of cybersecurity, there's the competing issue that the government is focused on, which is how do we protect people when criminals are actually using the internet, not destroying networks, but using networks to carry out physical attacks or even cyber attacks against other targets. And obviously in this day and age, a lot of the intelligence information we collect about what attacks are coming comes from what we're able to get over the internet or with other kinds of communication, which give us early warning about plans to carry out bad acts. Now, there's legal authorities to do this, and a whole separate discussion about how do we deal when you have data that lives all over the world and you've got multiple countries with different legal regimes. But putting that to one side, one of the things the government is concerned about is that as we focus on cybersecurity, one of the cures for cyber threats is encryption. That way, if someone steals the data and they can't crack the encryption, it's useless to them. So more and more tech companies, now full disclosure, I work with a lot of these companies on this issue, more and more companies in the technical field want to offer their customers end-to-end encryption where only the sender and the recipient has the key to decrypt the message. The government has argued, FBI Director Comey, that there ought to be a law that requires any provider of a service or a device to retain a duplicate key so that if there's a court order, with all the legal requirements met, to get that data decrypted, there's a duplicate key available that the government can use to get that. I understand that government says, well, you see, then you have all the protections of law. But if you stand back a little bit, I have several problems with it. One is I don't think that normally we organize our private business and activities and private personal lives in such a way as to make it easy for the government to get information about us if we do something wrong. If that were true, there'd be a law that requires us to walk around with a recording device on us at all times, so it'd be really easy to find out when we're doing illegal things. Second, I guarantee you that if you require American companies to have a duplicate key, companies elsewhere in the world will create encryption that doesn't have a duplicate key. So all you'll have done is have moved all the bad guys away into those companies, and you'll have created more vulnerabilities in the systems that the good guys are using, because with a duplicate key, there's a risk that the key will in fact get stolen or something. And third, what are you going to do with other technologies? What are you going to do with Snapchat, where the message disappears as soon as you read it? Are you going to make that illegal? Well, what are you going to do when someone takes a piece of paper in a letter and burns it? Are you going to make matches illegal? You can't win the game of trying to prevent people from hiding what they're doing. You have to do it the old-fashioned way. You have to outsmart them. And I think that's my view about what we have to do. I will say that back in the 90s, there was a similar issue with respect to encryption on telephone calls. And there was a move to create something called the Clipper chip, which was going to be a requirement to put in telephone company systems that would allow decryption on a court order. And that ultimately did not get passed. That law was not required. And there were a lot of people worried about, oh my God, this means we're going to go dark. We're not going to know what criminals are doing. And actually, I'm told we've now collected more since then than we did before. So I have a lot of confidence in our ability to use our tools when we have a court order or legal authority to get what we need. And I don't think we should deliberately dumb down our security in order to make it easier for the government to do that.
So that's a great way for me to introduce an apology, which was in my introduction of your bio, I forgot to mention that you'd been an appellate court judge for a long time. So if anybody can actually weigh and balance and have this thought process, has to be Secretary Chertoff, right? So that brings me to another, I'd like to follow up to what you were just saying, which is, do we as a nation and does our government have a proper understanding of where individual privacy actually fits into all of this? Or are we still too immature?
Well, I think we're wrestling with a huge number of changes in the area of data. First of all, we as individuals emit more data than most people really understand. Not only does your phone, emit locational data, for most people, if they search online, that data is kept somewhere. If you go to the grocery store, I don't know if they have it here, but back east, you have this little card you carry, and it gives you a discount on what you buy. But that means they have a record of everything that you bought every single time, so they know what you're buying. If you have a car, your GPS records where you went. And now they actually offer, one of the insurance companies says, if you put this device in your car and it'll show us that you drive safely and we'll lower your premium. So that's recording not just where you're going, but how you're getting there and whether you drive too fast or too slow or too fitfully. All this stuff, in many cases, can be sold or bartered or collected, and you get a profile of people that makes what the government collects look like chump change. It's trivial. And the question is, what's going to happen with that data? And what are the rules about what ought to be collected? And that's before we even get to things like Facebook and social media, where people know they're putting things out there. And so that's another source of data. So what are the rules going to be with respect to all of these things, particularly when things are being collected that you're not necessarily made aware of? For example, other people uploading pictures of you to the cloud, which can then be cross-correlated by the person who's managing the cloud or the company that's managing the cloud, so that even if you're not uploading pictures, they can get all the other pictures that others have uploaded. And I don't think we've come to grips yet as a society with how we want to strike that balance. Generally, the companies that offer the service basically do it by making it free. But it's not free. There's a saying, if you're not being charged, you're the product. What they're doing is they're monetizing your data. Now, maybe there has to be greater clarity about what's being collected, what uses can be made of it, and maybe you need to be offered a clearer choice. If you want the service for free, you have to consent to this. But if you don't consent to it, you can pay and get the service and pay a subscription fee. So I think that we're increasingly, I think there's a lot of uncertainty and discomfort around this. What I think is really going to change the game, though, is when we get to the Internet of Things, where your refrigerator, your thermostat, all these things are going to wind up being, if you want, being networked. And the argument is, this is going to make your life really easy. Your refrigerator will know when you're low on milk. It will immediately send a message to the grocery store. The grocery store will charge your bank for milk, and they'll make a milk delivery, and you'll wake up, and there'll be a little carton of milk outside that the truck delivered. Now, maybe that sounds really great. I, for one, am perfectly happy to actually look in the refrigerator myself, say I'm low on milk, and, honey, either you or I are going to go to the store and get some milk. But all these things will collect information, and there will also be pathways into your network where other information can be stolen or compromised. So I think what we need to do is to have a discussion both as individuals and as members of families, but also as a society about what are the limits, if any, what are the requirements if you're going to put these things in, what are the requirements the manufacturer has, for example, to upgrade or to notify about security problems. I mean, there are a series of things that have to be discussed, and I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, so that was going to be my question, which is the education piece. Is the private sector doing enough other than trying to sell gadgets, widgets, and products?
I mean, I think you're starting to see investment in cybersecurity, but I actually think it's got to start at the home. You've got to learn to ask yourself, whenever people say, I want your email address, or I want this, or I want that, you always have to say, why? Why do I want to do this? Why do I want to sign up for this? And what is it going to cost me in terms of data, and not just data privacy, data control over my information. I'm not someone who I'm not totally off the grid But when I do sign up for something, I ask myself a deliberate question. Do I want to share that data or not? What's the benefit to me of doing it? What's the downside for me doing it? And I think that's an educational process we need to start with kids, but it also needs to be done at an enterprise level and at a society-wide level.
Okay, so society-wise level, we live in a global economy. Globalization is the thing that everybody can talk about over lunch or cocktails. The question that arises in my mind, which is complex yet simple, would be, how do we actually get all the actors, public and private, that are working across international boundaries, to actually sit down and have a conversation about this, build protocols? You know, we talked earlier today about, you spoke earlier today about some of the conversations we've had with the Chinese, about don't touch this, and we all agree, and the rest of it, it's basic espionage that we've been doing for years and years, so we'll have to live with it in some form or fashion, and
So, I mean, well, we do, as I said earlier, the data is global, it moves globally. So the question is, what rules control the data? I'll give you an example. Right now there is, in Europe, a concept called the right to be forgotten. And it means if somebody can petition whatever agency and say, there's a story about me that can be searched and found on the internet in my bio about something I did like 10 years ago, and it's really embarrassing. I'd like it eliminated. So it's not that the story is false. It's just that I don't like it. So under the right to be forgotten, they can petition to make the search engine eliminate that data element or that story from a search of that person's name. Now, it doesn't, strictly speaking, take it off the internet, because there are parts of the internet that are not accessible by search engines, and so you can't erase it. But it means, for all practical purposes, for most people, it will disappear. And so if, let's say, someone in Italy invokes that and gets the order to get the right to be forgotten, then if anybody from Italy or Europe, an IP address that ends with IT or whatever, does a search of that person's name, it will not hit the information that has been forgotten. But now the Europeans are saying, well, wait a second. We want this for every search, even if it comes from the United States. And in the United States, we have a First Amendment, which says you can't tell people you can't read about things. You have a constitutional right to read. So what do you do if you're a global company? On the one hand, you have the Europeans saying, well, you're in Europe, so you have to follow our rules. On the other hand, the American government says, wait a second. The Europeans maybe can control what goes on in Europe, but they don't control what goes on over here. And the company's caught in the middle. So we have to find out a way to reconcile that. Now, some people take the attitude, here's how we reconcile it. We break the internet up. We require you to keep data about our citizens locally. We will control the data. And then you will no longer really have an internet. You'll have a national net. And you'll have really broken the internet. That's called data fragmentation or localization. The other attitude is to say, look, we need to come up with a set of principles to govern how you deal with data when it doesn't live any place, but it moves around. And we don't want to break it up. We want to have a global, worldwide web. And that's an area where I think there is some space for some discussion, at least with countries that are have similar values, like in Europe and things of that sort. It gets a little harder as you get to countries which are much more controlling in terms of the way data and information is held in their societies. But even there, like with Russia and China, and this is part of the thesis of the EastWest Institute, there are areas we could probably get some agreement on. And the way you make progress in resolving some of these differences, which could really be fatal to the internet, is you try to find areas where there can be a common agreement and start to build trust incrementally. So, for example, I believe that for the most part, put aside North Korea, most countries are not interested in seeing a lot of crime on the internet. So there's an area where you might be able to reach agreement on joint action against criminal behavior. There was an agreement that was reached, for example, with China on fighting against spam. So I think using mechanisms like the EastWest Institute and other both official and unofficial groups, we can find areas where we can see it's in everybody's long-term interest to preserve the commons, which in this case is the internet. And that means not allowing it to be broken up or interfered with. And I think that's ultimately what the solution here has to be.
So if we drill down one more level, I remember from one of our summits, there was a big conversation about law enforcement. And there were several speakers who were law enforcement officers from different countries. And they were having a debate, and the debate revolved around who gets the credit for what as we try to actually deal with cybercrime. Has that been resolved? Is that something that we can resolve?
No, I mean, you're always going to get that issue about who gets credit and who controls things. I mean, that happens in the U.S. Forget going internationally. I mean, you get fights between the feds and the state and between different states about who controls things. But I think you could get some general agreement in principle in some of these areas, because if you have too much criminality, it damages every country. And I think there's a common interest there in at least eliminating what everybody perceives as a common threat.
Okay, so that brings up another idea, another thought, which would be people and processes. When we talk about all this risk and these challenges, isn't the starting point at the end of the day for whether it's a government or a private company or an individual sitting at home, the extent to which or the degree to which you actually self-regulate and try to be careful? So for example, if you get one of these spam things that looks like a phishing with a PH, you're trying to figure out, did Bob or Sally actually send that thing to me? It's really first and foremost about the people, is it not? And isn't that the biggest challenge?
And I think there are precautions you can take. I mean, I for example, generally do not click on a link unless I have reason to believe, what they call out-of-band reason to believe, that it's genuine. So in other words, if we walked out of here and Laurent said to me, tomorrow morning I'm going to send you a video of this thing, and he sent it to me because we had the conversation in person, and I'm not paranoid. I don't think that, there are listening devices all over the place. I'm pretty confident that's going to come from him. But I wouldn't necessarily open something that came, there was a scam a while back where you were getting, it appeared to be messages from IRS. Your taxes and blah, 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 whatever, you have to click here. Now, I know IRS doesn't email you when there's a problem, but a lot of people clicked on that. So I don't mean to suggest it's easy, but you need to have some rules for how you do that. Another thing I don't do, I caused a stir among some journalists when I was interviewed once, and I told them this is, I don't use the Wi-Fi in Starbucks because I don't know who else is on the Wi-Fi and who's sucking down all the data. I use either my own password-protected Wi-Fi, or I have like a mobile Wi-Fi thing. But to me, I'm very careful about that. I don't mean to knock Starbucks. The coffee's good, but I don't want them to refuse to serve me now. But what I'm saying is, when you're in a public space and it's free Wi-Fi, you ought to be careful about what you do. So there's some basic things you can learn, what we call cyber hygiene, to reduce the risk. But even that's not a total solution.
I'm still writing checks.
Yeah.
Call me old-fashioned, but I'm still writing checks, and I'm a little concerned about getting on the internet and doing all that. All right, so we've been chatting here for about 50 minutes, and at the outset of this, the idea was to try to get you all involved somewhere, and we hope that we've pushed out a few thoughts and ideas. So we'd love to open this up to all of you and have questions. Please.
Really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
That was great. Could you talk a little bit more about the Iran agreement, and as you see that playing out over the next 10 years, the threats it might create?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm skeptical about this for a couple reasons. First, I think the objective changed from eliminating their capability over a period of time to reducing it. And so what you basically have at best, is a postponement for 10 years, and then a glide path where effectively we are tacitly recognizing they have the ability to get a bomb. So it's a delay. Now you could argue that it would be worth getting a delay if there was some reason to believe there's some positive benefit at the end of it, and you're not just kicking the can down the road so it's the next person's problem. But right now I'm not seeing any strategy to in any way blunt the nefarious activities that Iran is taking all over the world, whether it's in Yemen, in Syria, Hezbollah, of course, is operating in the Western Hemisphere. And many of you will remember that the Iranians were working with the Shia insurgents against the U.S., developing roadside bombs to kill American soldiers. So I'm not seeing any positive there. But what troubles me even more is I'm not convinced that the idea that there are going to be robust inspections, and as the president said, a snapback if there's a violation, I'm skeptical about whether that's real. First of all, the inspections, the process at a minimum creates 24 days of delay. But beyond that, it requires the inspectors to push to the mat if they're going to fight about it. And I'm not so sure they're going to be willing to do that. Second, AP revealed a preliminary draft of a quote, secret annex about how they're going to, the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Authority, is going to conduct inspections, in which they're basically going to look to the Iranians to provide the samples. And I'm like, wow, that's like a guy's on probation for drug offenses, and you tell him the drug test is administered, go home, give yourself a drug test and bring it in. Like, how long would you last as a probation officer with that kind of approach? I have not heard a categorical denial of that. What I've heard is, we don't talk about that stuff, we're satisfied. It sounds like a lot of walking around the problem. That's a problem for me. Third, I don't think there'll be a snapback. I think unless the Iranians videotape themselves detonating an atomic bomb, I think many countries, this goes back to the point I made earlier, will look to have a rationalization to avoid reimposing sanctions. Because I'll be blunt, particularly in Europe, there are a lot of companies that are going to make a lot of money out of this. And when the money starts flowing in, they're not going to be very eager to cut off the flow. And so there are going to be all kinds of reasons why, well, we don't really believe there's a violation, or it's a technical violation, or it's a trivial violation. So all this leads me to believe that as they build their economy and as they build their war chest and their treasury, over time we will see increased probing at the corners, trying to cheat a little bit, trying to push a little earlier, and then eventually we could well find them in a position where they're back where we are now in terms of capability to build a bomb, but a lot richer and with a lot more money. And I think that could threaten the stability of the entire region.
What's the alternative?
So here's the problem with the difficulty I have answering that question. The way this has been presented at this point, there isn't a lot of alternative, because it was maneuvered in such a way that the deal was done without much congressional input onto what the terms were. Then the executive branch went to the UN and got the UN to endorse the deal, and then came to Congress and said, well, you see, now if we don't accept this, everybody else in the world is going to say, well, we're walking away from the United States, we're going to lift the sanctions, so it's too late. So basically, this was unrolled in a way that painted us into a corner. And I think that was a mistake. I think that if there was an argument to be made for this deal, it should have been made up front, and it should have been honest, that it is not going to eliminate a bomb, that what we hope is it'll delay it long enough for there to be internal change that may ultimately reduce the risk for other reasons. And also to be honest, if we feel that we're in a box because many other countries want to start resuming trade with Iran and therefore they're getting restless, it should have been said. And then there should have been a discussion with the leaders of the Congress and the executive branch and the intelligence people about what's the best of a bad situation. But the way it unfolded, at least as it was reported, it didn't come out that way. And I still have to ask the question, why would you sign a deal with a secret annex? Like when John Kerry said, well, I didn't read it. I don't think I've ever signed a deal where I didn't read the deal. So you got to help me understand what the logic of that was.
Deborah?
Michael Lewis in Flash Boys detailed the story of the top secret Wall Street project to lay cable so they could do high-speed trading. And as you know, wired is always faster
Right.
than wireless, and you have your own encrypted. Have you thought about the vulnerability of the grid and the vulnerability of U.S. banking and commerce as we expand more and more Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
And similarly, when you look at other countries that are high-tech, like Israel and India, they're now moving to issue more wired and moving away from wireless in schools, and we are rolling it out with no consideration of the fact that it's slower and much more vulnerable and may have some health risks down the road.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think, first of all, it is true, my understanding is that wire is more secure than wireless, although it's not perfectly secure. And I do think, again, if you think strategically about how you protect our assets, if you have really critical infrastructure, I wouldn't necessarily be wireless, create wireless access. I mean, wireless is great if you're, going on MapQuest and you want to find out how to get to the nearest Starbucks. Say that's a plug for Starbucks. So that I'm making up for the thing about the Wi-Fi. But it may not work if you're operating on really critical infrastructure. And I do think generally, I will say that the utilities and the power sector and the financial sector tend to be among the most attuned and focused on this set of issues. But I think, it's illustrative of a larger problem. We have often rushed into technological changes because, this is really convenient, and it's neat, and it's fun. And, convenience is great, but it's not the most important thing. It's one of a number of important things. And safety and security, in certain respects, may even outweigh convenience. And I think that, this is a challenge for people in the industry to think through what are the consequences of building inherently fragile systems. I'll give you an unrelated example of the same phenomenon. In the supply chain world, just in time is the mantra. We want to have the minimal inventory, we want to just get what we need when we need it. So part of what I did as Secretary of Homeland Security was I was responsible for disaster management. And what I learned was this: just in time is great until there's a disaster. And then all of a sudden you are really up a creek because you don't have any of the necessary resources. Proper planning for an emergency requires you sometimes to build some extra margin of something that may not be necessary right away, but that you can call upon if you have an emergency. That's why we say people should store food or water or supplies for 72 hours, maybe have a generator, things of that sort, because you may not need it all the time, but when you really need it, you're going to miss it if you don't have it. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes efficiency needs to be balanced with other kinds of values.
So as we crave innovation and convenience, is there any way to perhaps control the innovators? I mean, is there any way to create some sort of liability, without stifling any sort of innovation? Because, for example, Whammo does not produce lawn darts anymore. Is there any way to protect us in that sense?
I'm skeptical and reluctant to say we ought to try to stifle innovation. I mean, obviously, it depends. I mean, if you're trying to innovate with, biological weapons, yeah, we ought to stifle that. But I mean, for most innovation, I think you're better off trying to come up with innovative solutions. But I do think there does come a point at some stage when you have to look at something and maybe you have to put some boundaries around it. And whether that's done legally or through market forces, I think depends.
I believe, by the way, that to this point, that Microsoft and others actually pay people hard cash to go in and look for flaws or
Oh, yeah,
try
no,
to,
they're what they
you know,
call ethical
and that's,
hacking.
that's another way to look at the
Yeah, ethical
answer.
hacking which is basically getting guys who are hackers to do, not to do damage, but to what they call penetration testing, to find out what your flaws are. Yeah.
Sir,
Risk or cyber analysis of former Secretary Clinton using her private server.
You know, I don't know what her server had, didn't have, what security it had, so it's anybody's guess. I mean, that's, I'm going to really mightily resist entering to that thicket. I have no idea what her server was like, and, you know, so we'll find out, I'm sure.
Why is Russia a threat?
You know, after the fall of the wall, I think we all, you know, Gorbachev and then Yeltsin were there, and we thought the Russians really, I mean, the Soviet Union disbanded, and we thought we might had a new cooperative relationship. Putin, I think, frankly, largely for domestic reasons, but also for ideological reasons, has really been determined to rebuild the glory of the Russian Empire. And I will tell you, I was in Russia back in 07 or 08, and I was at a dinner with, I was in government, I was at dinner with a number of my counterparts. And I was sitting next to a guy, and he was starting to say, oh, you know, we really miss the good old days. When Stalin was in charge, we were really powerful. And I'm like, what? I mean, I kept it to myself, but there's a real sense of kind of missed glory. And I think also there's a sense Putin has that the West is weak, that the cohesiveness of NATO is not what it once was. And I think he is testing us. He tested us in Ukraine. You know, they kidnapped an Estonian official, brought him over into Russia, and then accused him of spying, and they just convicted him. There are very invasive overflights and interceptions of civilian airliners in Western Europe. You know, they're being very provocative in testing. The risk is that he will misjudge, and at some point, he actually will precipitate something. But beyond that, you know, for several years now, he's been engaged in what they call information operations, which is what they used to do in the Cold War, to try to actually create false narratives and propagate them in the West. And they've gotten much better at it than they were with the KGB, particularly in Europe. So you have RT, which does a very sophisticated job of presenting the Russian point of view on what's going on in Ukraine, which is the United States tried to depose the Ukraine, and the U.S. wants to get rid of Putin and assassinate him. You have social media cadres that actually put out, you know, Twitter feeds and other social media that give the, quote, Russian perspective on things. The Russians are funding many of the right-wing populist parties, like Marine Le Pen's National Front. And if you poll, I got the results of a poll of many of these parties, they have a more favorable view of Russia than they do of the United States. Amazingly, in the paper today, there's a story about a guy named Jeremy Corbyn, who is now the leading candidate to be the head of the Labour Party in Britain, who is so hard left that he says NATO is the big problem, we should have disbanded it. The Russians are like the victims here. So a lot of this is being fomented and supported by Putin. So I think that creates a dangerous environment. And I think he's looking to push and ultimately maybe undercut the cohesiveness of NATO and the Western alliance.
Dr. Fleck.
Well, we have given, essentially, the U.S. has given tacit approval for Iran to get the atomic bomb. It's possibly delayed by 10 years, but that's essentially a fact as I see it. As a reaction, do we see that Sunni countries are going to be involved in an arms race?
I mean, I think that there is a much increased risk that you will start to see nuclear proliferation in the region as a counterbalance. And the problem is the more bombs you have, the greater the likelihood one will get loose, because the command and control system may not be what we're used to here or in Western Europe or even, frankly, in Russia. So Ironically, if you wanted to, as I think the president said at one point, you wanted to go to a nuclear zero, this is actually the wrong way to do it. So, you know, I think that, look, there's always the hope that there'll be a transformation in Iran in the next 10 years. But actually, if that was what the plan was, we should have been told, look, this is a Hail Mary pass. We're gonna hope that in 10 years the regime changes its mind about that. But that's not a strategy, that's wishful thinking.
Richard?
So it seems like there's a certain asymmetry in the information that an average American has about cybersecurity. So we hear all the time about Target being hacked or OPM or something, but we don't hear about hacks that are going on perpetrated potentially by us or our allies in Russia, China, Europe, wherever.
Stuxnet.
Stuxnet, thank you. That's the only one we really do. It's all I hear about. But, you know, I'm not trying to ask for classified information, but is there some sense that there's some counter warfare going on here and the other side just doesn't want to release it? Obviously, we don't want to release it.
I mean, I think the U.S. generally takes the position, we accept that there's going to be espionage, and, you know, every country practices it, you know, for national security purposes. And, you know, I mean, I don't think when the Chinese spy on us, I mean, we react, and if they catch, you know, I think the Germans kicked out some American recently because they said that he was involved in getting confidential information from a German. But, you know, I think we accept that, and it's the nature of espionage that every country breaks every other country's laws. I think where you've seen something different is where it's commercially oriented. You're stealing intellectual property on a large scale. And I also think there's a lot of concern about destructive attacks. And, you know, we haven't seen too many of those, but it's not clear what the rules would be if there was a destructive attack.
I think my question is really, our culture promotes the revelation of the attack when it occurs.
Well, we're victims, yeah.
It isn't clear to me that other societies embrace that.
Well, the Germans complained about, you know, there was that story about Merkel's phone being tapped. The Germans complained about that. Although why she was talking on a regular cell phone, unencrypted, didn't make a lot of sense to me. But, you know, so when it suits their purposes, other countries will accuse us of things. They may be right or wrong, exaggerated or not. But, you know, that's kind of the nature of the beast.
In the back?
How secure are our financial and brokerage institutions from cyber attack? And who are they most at risk from? The nation states, the criminals, the terrorists?
You know, I'd say most sophisticated financial institutions are quite good in the security area. It doesn't mean they're invulnerable, but they're quite good. Now, you know, you get denial of service attacks, which are kind of, you know, they're kind of low grade nuisance things. I mean, they can interfere with the website. It may take it down for a while, but it's not going to fundamentally, you know, damage the system. Where you get into trickier things are if you introduce something that creates a latency or delay in trading, or ferrets out confidential information. And, you know, I think there are some sophisticated actors who could do damage to financial institutions. And there are also a lot of tools for sale on the so-called dark web. But I still think I would grade our financial institutions as being, you know, at the high end of the spectrum in terms of security.
Someone in the middle? Please, in the back.
ISIS as an example of a serious threat. It seems to have emerged rather quickly. In your view, why has that happened?
Because I think that we did a number of things that actually reversed momentum from what we were making progress against this extremist ideology. I think that it was a combination of a number of bad things. One is in Syria, when there was the uprising against Assad, you know, who was mistreating the Sunnis, Although there was talk about helping the moderate Sunnis, we really didn't get them a lot of help. And what happened is the more aggressive and extreme started to attract the recruits, and therefore they started to become more capable. It's like the drug gang issue, too. Same model. I mean, it's a marketplace for violence. And the more violent you are, the more attractive you are in the marketplace. I think the withdrawal from Iraq and the fact that we lost influence over Maliki, and Maliki also mistreated the Sunnis, created an attractive opportunity for the remnants of what had been al-Qaeda in Iraq to reconstitute as part of this group, ISIS, and then bring in other disaffected people. And then, as I said earlier, I think we have not yet sufficiently taken them on there to actually begin to undercut their view that they're triumphant. At the same time, in Nigeria, we've had Boko Haram, and they've been ineffective in fighting that. And then, as I said earlier in a talk, when we went into Libya, the mantra that was repeated was, we're not going to get involved like Iraq. We're just going to go in, we're going to remove Gaddafi, we're going to step out of it. And I will take a little bow here. Mike Hayden and I wrote an op-ed piece at that time, and we said, the hard thing in Iraq was not the winning initially, it's what you do afterwards. And you've got to have a plan for dealing with it afterwards. We didn't. So now Libya is a total mess. The extremists that Gaddafi had in prison were released, and they created problems in Mali and Niger and in Algeria and elsewhere. The missiles that were in his armories, those are dispersed all over the place. And now you've got competing extremist militias in various parts of the region. So we basically, the enemy of terrorism is order. Now, it should be order with law and fairness, but ultimately it's order. When you create a disordered state or an area that has no order, you are inviting terrorists in. And essentially what we have seen is a state of disorder in parts of North Africa, in Libya, and below that in sub-Saharan Africa, and a disorder now in the area between Lebanon and the Euphrates River.
Pete?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming to Jackson. I'd like to switch, possibly now, we've had a lot of attention on Russia, Iran, Yemen. I'd like to switch into the Far East on the China issue. I'm a veteran of the Marine Corps. I spent about 17 months in the Far East. I know now we're pivoting our military strategy towards the Far East. I'd like to know what your take is on the Chinese aspirations, territorial aspirations in the South China Sea, particularly in the Spratly Islands, the Philippine area, the Scarborough Shores, and the Senkakus. It seems to me that I pay attention to this more on the military side, but that we're not addressing this in the press or in other ways that we should.
Great question. And I'm not a China expert, so I don't want to overstate what I can tell you. I do think since Xi Jinping came to power, there's been a change in China, and he's moved back into more of the Maoist model, by which I mean party first, economic development second. I think previously there was maybe a little bit of wishful thinking on our part that economic liberalization was going to lead to democratization. That does not seem the direction it's headed in. Now, of course, in the last week, we've seen serious economic problems there, and that may upset the whole apple cart. So right now, I would say that, and I think you know a lot more about this than I do, Laurent, and you can talk to it. Stability is the number one thing they're concerned about, stability for the party and stability for the country, which I think both explains the tightening up on keeping out foreign influences and foreign ideas, and also the anti-corruption campaign, because there is a recognition that corruption can be corrosive in terms of the legitimacy of the government. I do think that the way, as it was explained to me by someone I've worked with who's in Hong Kong, the Chinese government does view ultimately the legitimacy of its rule as based on its performance, not elections, but they have to show the public they're doing, they're living up to providing, the proper goods. I think militarily, again, part of what you're seeing is a greater aggressiveness in pushing at the margin. And again, maybe sensing that the U.S. is preoccupied elsewhere or our will is a little weak. I don't think they're looking to conquer Japan or the Philippines, but I do think they're looking to place themselves in a position where their ability to, deny us access to the area is expanded by the fact that they have these little outposts and they're building these artificial islands and stuff. I also think they're in intense relations with Vietnam, and they're trying to exert more authority over Southeast Asia, and I think there's resistance there. But I do think the Chinese, there's an ambivalence because I think what I've heard about private conversations with the Chinese is they're not all wild about the way this is headed. And there are, they've got huge economic issues at stake, particularly now, if they want to be a global economy, that will be undercut if they take certain kinds of political decisions. So to me, actually, it's a really interesting time to engage with China and to try to encourage those elements that see moving maybe back more in the direction of let's be major economic players and less belligerent, and away from the, no, we're going to go back to the more militaristic type of model. I don't know if that's...
Deniability and rationalization? Does that fit into this conversation? In terms of what we're doing or not doing?
No, I think with China, I don't know that we've been denying and rationalizing. I think that that's actually an area where I think we've been pretty good about pushing back to some extent on some of what they're doing in terms of intellectual property theft. And I think we've done a reasonably good job of reaching out to some of our allies there.
So it's 8:25, and we're not going to keep you till 10, by the way. But how about if we do 4 more minutes and we take 1 or 2 more questions? Sir?
Do you think AI will play a part in the near future, and if so, as a means of security or lack thereof?
Or you mean artificial intelligence?
As it refers to cyberspace.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole theory about the singularity where it's the moment when machines become conscious of themselves. I'm a big fan of the Terminator movies, and therefore I'm waiting for Skynet and, Arnold to come back. I don't know. I think there are questions, however, in the area of robotics about how autonomous systems ought to be if you're going to be engaged in lethal activity. It's one thing to control drones from a distance, another thing to give them the authority or the ability to choose targets autonomously. I'm skeptical about that, but I have to say it's not really an area that I have a great expertise in.
We'll see what Palantir can do. Sir?
So as we're sitting on the 10th anniversary of Katrina, what do you feel is one of the greatest lessons learned from our country, and how has that made us more resilient?
That's a great question. I think the lesson of Katrina is, I think a little bit of what I said earlier. You've got to build in a certain level of redundancy and planning for the worst. The doctrine prior to Katrina was that the response was in the hands of state and local governments, and the federal government supported them with money and certain kinds of assistance. And that has almost always worked in the country, but it did not work in New Orleans, and it did not work in Louisiana, and it was therefore necessary to try to build a response literally on the fly, which is not easy to do and doesn't work very well. So the lesson we learned out of that was to build a set of plans that were based on plan for failure. And that means equip yourself for failure, have a plan that you can deploy if there's a screw up, and then that gives you an ability to be more resilient. And actually, 2 years later, when we had Hurricane Gustav, because we had done all the planning, and we had, for example, an absolute census of all the senior citizens' homes and hospitals, when there was a sudden need to evacuate people because they decided they didn't want to stay in place, we were able to get the military in and do it within less than a day because we had done the planning. So the lesson is complacency is your enemy, and what you need to do is plan for the worst and hope for the best, and that's, I think, the lesson.
Okay, last question. Sir?
The title is How Secure is Our Nation? How would you say, how secure are we today versus 6.5 years ago?
I would say we are, in many respects, as secure, in some respects, less secure. I mean, we're less secure because we have a metastasis of violent jihadism, including more and more Americans and Canadians who on their own are willing to carry out terrorist attacks. We're less secure because I think Russia poses a threat to NATO. I think cyber has increased the security risks that we face. And I think that we've allowed some of our capabilities to degrade because we've not been able to get out of our own way politically and get stuff done that needs to get done in Washington. So I don't think we're in a crisis, but I think we're less than we were. But I will also say this, you never want to underestimate the American people. Look at those 3 guys on that train in Paris. The history of the last 20 years is littered with people who thought that Americans were pushovers. And, we have our national flaws, but one thing is when you poke us, we poke back really hard. And I think I fundamentally have a lot of faith in America and American security, but it doesn't take care of itself. And I think we need to have some serious, honest, strategic conversation about where we need to be over the next 5 years.
That is the perfect way to end this conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks. Great. Thanks a lot.